This is how you cross over from Israel to Gaza, and right now we're in no man's land.
Prime Minister, do you now regret when once asked what your favourite joke was, you replied, Nick Clegg? And Deputy Prime Minister, what do you think of that?
Mr. Trump, why should you be president? What makes you fit for the role? Is it just one big ego trip?
Thank you very much.
People aren't sure they can trust what you say. You
Exactly.
say things and then it turns out that they're not quite what you said.
And if we deliver what we say we're going to deliver.
My name's Andy Bell and I've been a journalist for over 30 years. In this podcast series, How Did We Get Here?, I try to provide context and background to a big story in the news by talking to someone with real insight. This week, what's going to happen to the world of work after COVID? Who's going back to the office? Who's happy not to? And what's this going to do to our towns and cities? I've been talking to Polly Mackenzie, Chief Executive of the independent think tank Demos. They've been crunching the numbers and doing the analysis to try and establish what a post-pandemic Britain may look like. And, spoiler alert, she doesn't think we're going back to where we were. Polly Mackenzie, thanks very much for taking part in this edition of How Did We Get Here about work and where we're going to be with the world of work. Now, your think tank, Demos, you're organising an event and as part of that, you say this is a unique moment to remodel our workplaces and our working lives. Do we want that? Is that what we need right now?
Yeah, so all through the pandemic, we at Demos have been working on a programme called Renew Normal, where we've involved about 50,000 members of the public on this question of what of all of this kind of tidal wave of change, what's been good that we want to keep and what's been bad. And we want, both government and business to focus on getting us back to normal as quickly as possible. And we've identified that actually work is one area, one of the top areas where people feel like they've actually learned something or changed something or got something that is good out of this pandemic in terms of the way they have worked, the way they have been more flexible and they've been able to work from home. There's a huge caveat to that. About half the population has never worked at home and will never work at home. There are huge numbers of jobs, whether it's, building buildings or serving people in a hotel. We could just list them. Working in a hospital, for example, you just can't do from home and you never will be able to. So we need to be clear that there's just a big chunk of the population, there's sort of white collar jobs really, that might possibly change and change quite dramatically as a result of this pandemic. And primarily because people have experienced doing things differently, businesses have experienced employing people differently, and actually, not exclusively, there's bad bits, but on average, people want to stay this way and work differently, even once the pandemic is over.
Okay, well, let's look at the data. You've obviously been working on this at Demos, but I imagine there's other data as well. What do we know about the numbers of people who, as a result of the pandemic, have fundamentally changed the way they're working?
So we can't know for certain, but we think about a third of the population has newly worked from home during the pandemic. And our estimates are that about 20% of people want to stick with that in one way or another, even after the pandemic is over. Now, people, of course, are sometimes wrong about what they want. And I think lots of people who have worked from home found it stressful at the beginning, then they got used to it, and now they're starting to miss some stuff about the office, about collaboration, about physically seeing people. But even though people's opinions and preferences and their bosses' opinions and preferences are going to change a bit, we're forecasting that basically between about 10 and 25% of the population will work from home substantially more than they did before. And even if it's only 10% who end up really transforming the way they work, the thing to think through is that's enough to change how important it is to fix home heating, for example, and home energy efficiency. It's enough to change the viability of all those Starbuckses and pret-a-manger's in our city centres. It's enough to change the subsidies we need to put into our public transport system if we want that to work. So even though it's not going to change for everybody, it might change for enough people that huge things about how we work and how the places we choose to work and our kind of economic infrastructure may need to be adapted quite radically and quite quickly if they're going to be sustainable.
Is there any evidence that maybe when we had the first lockdown and it was a bit of a novelty, people said, "Ooh, I quite like this, discovering this way of working. But the longer it's gone on, has that tailed off? Is it possible to say whether there's been any effect of that kind?
I think there's definitely been an effect of that people are more productive than they thought they would be. But as time goes on, the novelty wears off, and a sense of, oh, actually, I really wish I could, get in a room with some people with some, I don't know, a whiteboard, some pens and some Post-it notes. And people are noticing some of the things that they are missing. We know young people, for example, often, benefit from just being around more senior, more experienced people, picking up on, whether it's water cooler conversations, being able to sit in on a meeting. So I think there's no question we will see some, what you'd call kind of regression to the status quo ante, going back to normal a bit. So we sort of surged forwards around home working, and people will start to think, actually, I want a bit less of this. So we've been talking to the rail delivery group, for example, who are the people who make sure that the rail network works, right? And obviously we've seen this huge reduction in the first lockdown of the number of people using the trains, down to like 5%. That's then went back up to perhaps 20-25% of their normal volumes. And then we went through a second lockdown, it went down again, but not as much as it went down the first time. And as we come out, we can expect that to go up a bit, but it's still massively, massively down. They're predicting that numbers will go up again as things get back to normal, as social restrictions are lifted. But what they're worried about, and I think we all need to kind of think through, is what if everybody decides they want to only work in the office 2 days a week? And what if everybody chooses Tuesday and Wednesday? Obviously not everybody will, but that means that the rail network has got to be big enough for, huge numbers of commuters a couple of days of the week, and then it's going to be short on people, short on passengers paying fares, of course, for the rest of the week. There's years, right? There's been pressure for us to have part-time season tickets, because if you were a part-time worker who was only wanting to commute 2 or 3 days a week, it was just way more expensive as a proportion of your earnings to do that. And there's sort of been, policymakers have sort of explored that around the margins. But now, actually, if that's going to be a dominant way of working for lots and lots of people, we need to, who's going to pay the fares for our railways? Even if you go back up to 50-60%, these are not very profitable businesses. Actually, they work on tightly regulated margins. So do we want trains? Do we want more suburban trains? We've been talking endlessly about the infrastructure we need in the north for the whole government's levelling up agenda. Well, the subsidy model for that probably needs to be reinvented or rethought through too.
What about the kind of productivity of people if they're working from home? I mean, I'll declare an interest here. I've been at home partly for quarantining, and watching my two of my daughters working from home. They seem to be working very, very hard and long hours. Is there any evidence of the productivity? Are people just working longer, or are they actually being, quite productive as well?
Well, there's long been evidence that people who work from home tend to give back about 60% of that commute time to their employers if people make the shift. They just, if you haven't got to travel an hour to work, maybe you get to your desk half an hour early. And so that's quite clever, actually, because you, the employee, get a bit more time to yourself, and the employer gets a bit more time of you working. I think lots of employers are very worried about productivity. And that's why, we're really interested in this question of how you can start to manage the outputs of your workers instead of the times that they're spent working. We're seeing kind of a growth in monitoring tools where people can kind of monitor the keystrokes that you are typing, or the exact amount of time you're spending at your desk, even kind of video monitoring to see if you're there in front of your computer, because God forbid anybody ever goes to the toilet or makes a cup of tea. And, that kind of sort of big brother watching is, I think, what bad managers do when they're not really finding good ways to measure the outputs or what your team is delivering. So that's why we think we need to actually use this as an opportunity to think much more creatively about productivity, because actually what matters is what people are doing. And if somebody manages to do an hour's work in 45 minutes, that's probably a good thing. And maybe you could get 5 of those minutes back again for the employer to get started on the next task. But if the employee gets 10 minutes back too, and gets to be more relaxed, have more well-being. That's actually really good because you have to remember that in the UK we have a real problem with sick days, with the number of days lost to stress, kind of culture of presenteeism, where you're supposed to kind of drag your weary, broken body and into the office to sneeze all over everybody. Actually, maybe this is an opportunity to change that culture too, and say, if you're going to cough and sneeze, can you at least do it at home?
But there's going to be a bit of a leap for management to make. I mean, I'll be honest, I was one of those people who used to say, oh, working from home, and sort of cast my eyes up to heaven as if, actually what you're doing is you're watching daytime TV and sort of occasionally sending an email. But it's not been that from what I can see, but I imagine for managers it is quite difficult to work out whether people are working properly, or is it that difficult, or is it just say, look, let's look at the outputs instead of, as you say, just the hours spent in front of the screen? Is it actually a bit easier, and it's just a question of people getting themselves into a different way of thinking about it?
I don't think it's necessarily easier, but it is exactly that. It's about finding a different way to think about it. And recognize, that's effort, right? That's effort for managers, for organizations to think this through and help to embed new systems. We've all had colleagues, I expect, who were, working from home, and then you'd call them and they're like, oh, I'm just walking the dog right now. And you'd sort of feel like actually what they were doing was taking the day off, right? Like, I have worked with those people have irritated me too. I think and there's always going to be problems, right? There will be some people who are rubbish at their jobs, and there will be some people who are feckless and who are, need kind of management interventions. So that's not going to go away. I think what we'll need to learn is, how do you identify good performers and bad performers? How do you reward them when you can't use the things that we've used before, which is just seeing who's messing about at their desk and who seems to be working hard. So it's not easy, but it is an opportunity, I think, for us to do that differently. There's loads of practical skills that we're going to have to learn, right? Hybrid meetings, where, what if you get 3 people who really need to come to the office? I've got one member of staff who still sharing a bedroom at home with one of her siblings. She's got a bunk bed. Half the time I'm on a video call with her and she's sitting on her bunk bed with a laptop, right? That's not great for her. Much better for her to be in an office where better for health and safety, better for her kind of headspace, her well-being. And I think that there's definitely a group of people, especially young people, especially people who don't have a home of their own, for whom coming to the office is going to still be really, really important. And then if you have half your team at the office and half aren't, like, what does a hybrid meeting look like? What's the technology infrastructure? What do you need to put in your meeting rooms? How do you make sure the people who aren't there still are present, still are able to engage? Like, even, what does hands up look like? All of that, is a challenge for managers, for businesses and new companies to support us through, I think.
And creativity. What about, the sort of things that we take for granted that are indefinable about being in an office space? Can you really reproduce the kind of whimsy or serendipity of people bumping into people and talking and chatting and saying, let's go and have a quick cup of tea and talk? What if a lot of us are working from home? Don't we run the risk of losing some of that?
I think we definitely do. And there's 2 kind of workarounds for that. One is, there's lots of new technology, whether it's, having a Discord server, whereby everybody can just sort of sit and listen to ambient office noises of all of their colleagues all day and chat. So you can kind of create a virtual environment that's a bit like that. And there's loads of new technologies popping up that offer you those things, or serendipitously pairing you up with a colleague to be your random tea partner for the week. But I think people will still use offices, right? It's just a question of what will people use offices for. And so there's loads of thinking that property companies or landlords are going to need to do, or even, fit out consultants about. We've changed our office at Demos, actually. We've got a big space for, just desks and working and computers, and a small space which was for events and meetings. And we flipped that around because we realized people aren't going to mostly come to the office for just sitting there quietly working. They'll come to be creative, to collaborate, to have a big meeting, or to scribble on whiteboards and use vast quantities of Post-it notes. So actually that's what the office is therefore going to be for. And we're seeing lots of more forward-thinking property companies starting to do that with their space as well. So I've heard about people unbundling space. So instead of, the 7th floor belongs to X company and the 8th floor belongs to Y company. Actually, what you've got is you've got meeting rooms, you've got quiet working space, you've got town hall spaces, you've got hybrid meeting room spaces. And essentially you book them for the function of the meeting that you're going to have. That requires more nimbleness, more creativity, but it potentially unlocks better productivity from, an individual footprint of an office space. If people have space that's adapted to particular needs of particular modes of thinking, instead of us assuming that all thinking happens in, sort of serried rows of desks.
Okay. Now, we've largely talked about all of this, the impact on the individual and the way they work. But obviously, this is going to have a huge impact on, our society, cities. We've already touched on the idea of what it's going to do to our rail networks, that kind of thing. What about what it's going to do to our city centres? I mean, presumably, there will just be many fewer people on any given day, especially probably on Monday and Friday, from what we've talked about, if people want to work partly from home. Going to be many fewer people in our city centres, and that's going to have a big knock-on on all sorts of areas of life, isn't it?
Yeah, it's coupled with, we know, a move to more online socialising as well, and more online shopping. And I think some of that, again, will bounce back once the pandemic is over and once restrictions are lifted. But when you've had some technology companies say they've had kind of 10 years worth of adoption in just 10 weeks of that first lockdown, even if half of that bounces back to the way things were, you've still had a massive shift. So the viability of our city centres is in just an enormous question mark. And we saw over the summer the government was sort of desperate to get people back, whether with subsidies or public information campaigns, like, please come back, please come back. And it's about more than protecting coffee shops, right? It's huge chunks of the economy, and then underlying that economy, the hospitality and the retail economy, is also the property values, which people's pensions are invested in. So going through the adjustment of what value looks like in our city centre is going to be painful. I guess the upside is that possibly this is the first macroeconomic trend, certainly in my lifetime, that has the potential to benefit towns. We've seen the smallest high streets. We've seen, small bakeries in particular seem to have just boomed, because people's, whatever town centre spending that might have been at Starbucks might now be at the local bakery going out to buy a sandwich 5 minutes from their house. And so there's the potential for vibrant, small high streets to really thrive in a different way. It's I guess sort of experiential retail that you might get at big shopping centres has some value too. I guess it's those sort of middling, generic, identikit high streets that we've had with chain shops, chain restaurants, stuff that you can just kind of replicate anywhere. But I think that's where we will see a real struggle. And so we're going to have to rethink. I think a society needs places where we have shared interactions, common experiences. And we've had the benefit of that in our high streets, basically subsidized by the fact that retail was physically present for a really long time, 150 years. Retail's allowed that to be, those high streets to be the center of our common experience. And we actually just need to rethink, how are we going to make it viable for pubs, for restaurants, for our cultural sector? What is it that people will travel for? What does government subsidy look like? What do property taxes look like? I mean, this is huge, but we shouldn't forget the social value of places where we connect, places where we experience things together. We just can't rely on basically retail footprint to pay for all of that for us.
I mean, do we just have to assume that our city centres are going to be less vibrant? There's going to be fewer people there. There's going to be empty spaces where there were people going into offices. There are going to be places that catered for those workers who came out to buy their lunch. Is it just going to feel a bit quieter in the centre of London or the centre of Manchester?
I think it just definitely is. So I guess the question is, how do we adapt our finance models, our planning laws, so that what we don't get is just a lot of vacancy, and so that you can allow properties, that physical infrastructure to adapt and to change.
And does that mean that things like property prices, I mean, as you mentioned already, that a lot of pensions are invested in a lot of this value, city centre properties, city centre flats that everyone was 10 years ago scrambling to get hold of? What's going to happen to the prices of those?
I think we're going to see an adjustment. We don't yet know how big that adjustment is going to be, but we've already seen, I don't know, companies like WeWork struggling, other property companies, even something like the Crown Estate seeing huge drops in the rental revenues that it's getting. If we get, lots of companies are sort of struggling through this period, partly as a result of government subsidies that may then not last once those subsidies are gone. So we will see voids, we will see drops in rental revenue, and that adjustment will, exactly how investment properties are valued is, really complicated. There's quite a long lead-in time really for it to filter through to when they have to mark to book the adjusted value of that. But the pain will come, and it will be felt in pension funds. And I think that's one of the reasons why the Treasury have tried to push us to go back to normal, is because they know that adjustment is going to be painful. I just think that in the end, we're better off trying to support adaptation to a new model than trying to prop up an old one against all of market forces, which won't sustain it.
I mean, as you said before, coming from the other angle, for a long time people have been trying to work out how, for instance, to divert investment or all activity away from London, and now it's sort of happened. Maybe we should be grateful in some way, in an awful way, for what's happened, but actually the outcome could be fitting in with something which, policy has been trying to achieve for a while.
Yeah, I mean, I think the United Kingdom will always benefit from a strong London. And there might, I don't know, some people who hate London might get a sort of Schadenfreude sense of joy seeing, I don't know, vacancies on Oxford Street or something. But I think we need a strong London, but actually if there is an opportunity for other places to thrive and adapt, that absolutely is good. We should have a more equal and an economy with more centres, more vibrancy, including, given that, the imperative of climate change, actually being able to have people who can live and work in a 15-minute area is really, really exciting. We know that's good for well-being, hopefully good for carbon emissions if we can sort out people's home insulation and get more people traveling by bike, all of that. So yeah, there's an opportunity here. There definitely is. I guess local authority leaders, town centre managers, local politicians need to be willing to adapt. I guess we're seeing a few too many people in those kind of towns who just sort of want to go back to having the high street that they knew, or back to the public services that they knew. We're going to have to change and adapt. We might need to see co-working spaces for people, in small towns or even in villages, to allow people to kind of come together and have some of that creativity and adaptation. And those places might replace even beloved shops or beloved banks. So I guess we just have to be confident at leaning into change. And I know that is difficult for people. But I think it's where the opportunity lies here.
Although, just picking up on that, I wanted to ask you about sort of generationally. I mean, normally the older generations are worse at leaning into change, but is there evidence that actually the older generation has been a bit better, or has enjoyed embracing the change of working practices more than younger ones who might be stuck in smaller places? You mentioned your colleague who's sharing a bedroom, and who maybe crave a little bit more socialisation, whereas by the time you get to sort of slightly wearier older age, you're quite happy to be not flogging in and saying, I think I'll just work from home today, that's fine by me. Is there a generational evidence of how this is working?
I mean, I've picked that up anecdotally as well, but when we've asked the population as a whole about how they feel about this level of change, you still get the general tendency of young people to be just more optimistic and flexible than older people. So it's certainly true that if you've got a spare room that you can turn into a study It's going to be a lot easier to work from home than if you are, in a shared flat with no communal space, trying to kind of fight in a microscopic kitchen for a little bit of space to set up your computer. And you need decent internet connection. But actually, the exclusion from decent internet connection often includes people who are in rural areas, who then may be older people who've moved out of the centre of town. So I think it's complicated. And in general, the predominant thing I'd say is that young people are more optimistic, they're more open to change. So we've asked people if they've changed their minds about how they want to live their lives as a result of coronavirus. And about a quarter of people say yes, but that's about 15% of people in their 60s and about 40% of people in under 25s. So that the sort of general tendency of young people to think they can, change the world, do everything, is probably the predominant instinct here, regardless of the practicalities.
You mentioned how you've changed things slightly at Demos. What about your own sort of personal experience? And have you changed the way you work?
Yeah, so, I've got 3 small children. So obviously the first lockdown was extremely difficult with the schools closed, no childcare. But yeah, since the children have been back at school, what we've done, my husband and I, is adjust to basically having a couple of days a week where we stop at 3 and pick the kids up. And that's actually been really nice to just adjust working patterns, squeeze work into the days where I can really, really focus, go into the office a couple of days a week, and then have days where actually I'm more available as a parent. And I think lots of people have done that.
You're going to hang on to that change, are you?
Yeah, we are going to hang on to that change. But, I recognise I'm speaking from a position of real privilege. And, our school has changed so that they now stop at 1 on a Friday. And we're lucky that we can work around that. But I know there's a lot of parents for whom, as I say, half the population can't work from home, will never work from home, regardless of pandemics or flexible working trends. And we have to make sure that our public services still work for those people too, even if that means they're more expensive.
Okay, and we're getting towards the end now, but let's say a year from now, let's say we haven't had another wave, the vaccines are working in the way we're all hoping they're going to work. We're basically through the pandemic. A year from now, paint a picture of how we're working. Have we just gone back to where we were? Has there been a real change? Sort of set it out for me a little bit.
I think there's no question in my mind that we will not have gone back to normal. We will have seen a lot of jobs disappear. That's the first thing we have to remember. Rishi Sunak said our economic woes are only just starting. I don't think that is true, but there's a lot of people who are still just clinging on who won't still be clinging on. So rebuilding employment will be the first imperative.
And those jobs will disappear where? What sort of sectors? The
hospitality, the retail sectors, cultural lives. We know lots of freelancers have struggled enormously. And often in sectors that will just struggle to recuperate. So we will have lost capacity in the economy. And that will take, the Treasury, the Office of Budget Responsibility is saying it will take 3 or 4 years to even get back to where we were just in terms of economic growth before this pandemic. But those of us who are lucky enough to still have jobs, basically that half of the population who potentially can work from home, I reckon about half of them again, so about a quarter, will be working from home more than they were in the past, and that will be having a really serious knock-on effect on demand for the internet to work, first and foremost, but also on our commuting patterns, on well-being. Lots of positives, but also lots of negatives, and we need to rethink our model of how we fund public infrastructure, including the infrastructure of our high streets, if we want the interactions that we value so much in a shared society to still be possible.
And final question, overall, very tricky one to answer. Do you think we could end up, obviously people losing their jobs be, very awful for them in the short term, but in the longer term, could we end up overall in a better place because of these changes that are being forced on us?
I think it's open to us, to make this a moment when Britain changed for the better. That's not to negate the suffering. But, Matt Hancock said, when he was announcing the vaccine that this was a day to remember and a year to forget. And I love the rhetorical flourish, but I think that he is fundamentally wrong. Of course, it was a glorious day, but it's not a year to forget. It's a year to learn from. It will affect livelihoods. It will affect values, experiences for decades to come. And so we have to find a way to see the positive and build on the positive. And that means being open-minded about the lessons to learn and the opportunities, and not trying to forget.
Polly Mackenzie, thanks very, very much indeed for talking to us. Really enjoyed it.
Thanks very much for having me.
Polly Mackenzie from Demos, with a cautiously optimistic view of what a post-COVID Britain could be. And Demos are hosting an online event on December the 9th to launch what they're calling their new Work Shift Commission. If you have thoughts on this or any other podcast, please email me on andy.bell@itn.co.uk, and I'm tweeting at AndyBell5News. And please share and review. Thanks for listening to this edition of How Did We Get Here? There'll be another along soon.